So, welcome this evening. I'd like to welcome Father Adrian Lawrence, who is, maybe we can close that door in the back there, who's a really good friend of mine, Father Adrian, and we were in the States in seminary together and in Rome, and we did a lot of study time together and philosophy together, and so it's a great joy to be able to invite Father Adrian to come and be able to share with you some of his knowledge, which today he'll explain why he's focusing on what he's focusing on, because he's doing his doctoral thesis in philosophy, and he has a lot of experience also with university students and people all over the world, but also in Mexico. He's from California, and he can give a little introduction about himself. And tonight the talk's going to be about the existence of God being based on faith or science. So I'll leave it up to Father Adrian, and thanks,
Father Kramer.
Yeah,
I've known Father Kramer for 20 years now. Yeah, we're old. What can you say? So yeah, from California, seminary. Back in the day, I've worked apostolically in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Germany. Yeah, I think that's about it, right? And now, hopefully, to help a little bit here in Italy as well, with Father Kramer, since he invited me. This is a talk on the existence of God. The subtitle might be a bit confusing. It's like faith or science. It's not confusing, misleading, I would say. Because in a certain sense, we're not going to be seeing God's existence either from the point of view of faith or of science. We'll see later on why. It's actually going to be a point of view more of philosophy. Because we'll see that science is not the most adequate method to study something which is immaterial, right? Which would be God. So we'll get into that. I've been interested in apologetics and all these topics for quite a few years now. There's a lot of YouTubers and podcasts now on apologetics that I've followed. And this is actually fruit of, different things, but mainly Brandon Vaught. He has a website called Claritas U, and there he has a bunch of modules on different topics about the faith. So this one I kind of take from there and other places. I don't know if you guys remember, but back in the day in England, this is like 2005-ish or so, there was a whole movement, atheist movement, basically trying to show that God doesn't exist or it's ridiculous to believe in God, whatever. And they paid to have this written on buses. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. Right? So this is one way of seeing God, right? So if God doesn't exist, then I don't have to deal with him. I kind of live my own life and everything's great. We'll look into that objection as well. Today, we're going to be seeing, first, what are the three positions on the existence of God? Then, why should we even be interested or care whether God exists? Because it could be indifferent, whether he exists or not, whatever, I'll die and it's over, right? Then, the emergence of the new atheism, exemplified by the buses. Then we'll see arguments against God. Then this will just only be one slide, but we'll see that basically many of these arguments against God have a false view of what God is. So you're attacking the wrong thing, right? Like, we're not saying Zeus existed out there on Mount Olympus, so it's different. Then we will see three arguments for the existence of God. Now here, you could dedicate a whole lot of time to arguments for God. There's like at least 20 different types or different versions. Some can get extremely complex. I think the longest one is by Duns Scotus in De Principio Supremo or something like that. It's like pages of just all these logical connections. And yeah, we're not going to do that one today. So, first thing, three positions on the existence of God. We have the theist, who believes that there is a personal God. So this is very different from, kind of like a new agey, there's like a principle in the world. No, when you're a theist, you think there's a personal God. Or many personal gods. Because if you're a Hindu, for example, you can say there's millions of gods or something, right? Then you have the atheist, which says it's an affirmative position. There is no God. And here, we have the Greek theist comes from theos, meaning God. Atheist, no God. The aprivative in Greek. And then we have those who don't know, right? Agnostic. So, no gnosis, no knowledge. I don't know if God exists, right? The majority of people tend to be here because it's very difficult to prove that God does not exist. Actually, it's impossible, right? Because he does exist. But let's just say it'd be much more difficult, right? Whereas just having problems with the arguments for God is an easier position to take, right? So they would be the agnostics. I'm not convinced by your theist arguments, etc. And actually, I might have some arguments against it, but I'm not 100% sure. So these are the three positions. So why should we be interested? Well, there are consequences to our thoughts, right? We could see first, if he doesn't exist, perhaps it's good, you know? If he doesn't exist, perhaps it's bad. What would happen to the world if God doesn't exist? Well, taking the positive bus thing, well, we just enjoy our life and don't have to worry about, some God out there. Remember, one atheist said, believing in God is like living in North Korea. There's some kind of, person looking down, dictatorship, God's there, checking every action you do. So we're gone. Poof, we're free. No more God looking at what we're doing. Dostoevsky says, if there's no God, everything is permitted. Which can go bad very quickly, because it's very permitted for everyone else too. But, we'll get there. Religion, is the cause of all wars. Well, okay, God doesn't exist, no more religion. We're just all happy together. See that there's problems with that one as well. And then the pie-in-the-sky religion that distracts us from the present world. Marx, we get over that. Now, let's dedicate ourselves to this life, because it's all we've got. Because if God doesn't exist, we probably don't have immortal souls, and this is probably all we got. So, unless we start having transhumanists be able to upload our consciousness to the web, and then we can continue existing. But even there, we'll see it has problems. Even the web will go away. So, if he does not exist, what would happen to our worldview? Well, some bad things can happen, right? If he doesn't exist, we're just bags of chemical reactions walking on a tiny planet lost in a multiverse of Marvel. No, that is the result of chance. So it's like we're just one speck. Some people are like, I get comfort in that. I'm a nobody. It's like, well, maybe you get comfort in that. But that's all we are. We're just propagating our DNA. So some blind cosmic process that coughed us up in the first place will eventually swallow us all again, right? And so here's the problem with the getting up onto the web. The problem is that, yes, we will have individual death if there is no heaven or no soul or God or anything. But we're also condemned to collective death, thanks to the second principle of thermodynamics, right? Everything's going towards entropy. Not entropy, that's the word. Can't remember right now, but the point is thermal death. I don't know if you guys have heard of thermal death. The point is, little by little, the energy levels get lower and lower in the universe as things go, right? So over billions and billions of years, eventually, the sun will go out, the stars will go out, all the atoms will be infinitely or whatever, separate from each other. So basically, life will be totally impossible. So even if somehow we go onto the internet will go away because of just physics, right? If there is not some supernatural thing that goes beyond physics. Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, they would also be correct that our lives are absurd. It's like we're free, we want to know all things, we want to, we're open to everything, but in the end, what's the point of such a beautiful life if it's just going to end, right? Also, if God doesn't exist, there's no immorality. There would be no basis for morality. If there's no immortality, I got confused. And here, this is from Start Again. A few hours or years doesn't matter when you have lost eternity. You're just postponing the inevitable. And this is from Richard Dawkins, who's obviously a very famous atheist. There is, at the bottom line, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines to propagate DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. That's all we do. Evolution. That's it. I'm sure you guys have heard of Pascal's wager or bet. This was written in his book, The Pensées, or The Thoughts. He was it's an unfinished work. And he said, okay, well, maybe after all that, before, we're kind of like, okay, well, there's bad things would happen and good things would happen, but what if we just can't know? What if we're agnostic? He's like, okay, well, maybe the arguments against and for won't convince you, but what options do we have? We have 4 options. Number 1, we can believe in God, and if he exists, there's a chance we can go to heaven. We can believe in God, and if he doesn't exist, well, you die, and nothing happens. You may not believe in God, and if he doesn't exist, then again, well, you also die, and nothing happens. And you may not believe in God, but if he exists, well, then getting to heaven might be a little bit more difficult. So these are his wager. There's many ways of kind of explaining this. But those are the general things like, what are your chances? Is it better to put your chances to bet on the God horse in the race or to bet on the non-God horse? Well, seems like you don't lose too much betting in God, and you could lose a lot if you don't. So that's Pascal's wager. But at the bottom of this, it feels like all men want to understand whether God exists. We realize this is a very important part of our lives. St. Augustine, in his autobiography, wrote, "You have made us a Lord for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." Now we're going to move on to the emergence of the new atheism. Now, atheism is a thing that goes way back. You can even find atheism like in the Greeks and who knows what. But then there's like, let's say, modern atheism, which would be Hume. Well, he's the most famous of the big names in the beginning. But then it just keeps going on to Sartre, Camus, etc. But that was like last century. We want atheism this century, right? And these are these four guys. So we have Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett. Well, see, this new atheism starts after September 11th. Normally, if you see in history like big bouts of atheism, it tends to be after like natural disasters or something really bad, because like, how could God exist if all this evil exists, right? So after September 11th, we start seeing kind of this renewal in, or say, much bigger in the internet, the whole idea of atheism, right? But it's not so new in its arguments. It's mostly new in the way they go about doing it. Instead of proving God doesn't exist, they mock religion, right? They want to show that it's ridiculous, irrational, obscurantist, medieval, retrograde, and some even dangerous. I don't remember if it was Sam Harris or not, who said teaching your children religion is child abuse. So at that level, some of them have gone. So this expansion is also thanks to a new medium, the internet. It's a lot easier to attack religion anonymously, when you're just like, skibum345@gmail.com, right? And because if you're talking to your aunt who believes in God, and I mean, you don't want to be like rude, So there's a whole new forum and place for atheism to grow, right? What is the religious reaction? Well, here's some of the people that I've followed that talk about God's existence. William Lane Craig is very famous. I mean, he has his book, obviously, but like on YouTube, you can watch a lot of his debates. He's debated a bunch of people. Really interesting stuff. We have Father Robert Spitzer with the Magis Center. He's much more into the whole faith-science aspect of the debate. Bishop Brandon Vaught, from which this is mostly from, his Claritas U, but he also has another website called Strange Notions, which is basically a place for atheists and theists to come together and debate. So it's kind of like a blog debate format. And if I remember correctly, he got up to like 3 million users at one point over a certain period of time, which made it like the biggest outreach to atheists in the Catholic Church. Then we have Catholic Answers, their School of Apologetics, and YouTube and radio and everything, and Austin Ivory with Catholic Voices. So what are the two ultimate difficulties that atheists pose to us theists? One, there is insufficient evidence. So this is the famous story with Bertrand Russell, who said, what happens if you died? And then all of a sudden, boom, you're before God, or you're before St. Peter and the pearly gates, and God's like, why didn't you believe in me? He would say, not enough evidence, God. Not enough evidence. The question is, what does he mean by evidence, and what kind of evidence is he looking for? That we'll see. Then there's the problem of evil. I would say definitely the biggest argument against the existence of God. No? How can we have a good, omnipotent God coexist with the Holocaust, etc.? So, if you guys want a conference on that topic, it's for another day. There's a lot of stuff to talk about there. Throwing it out there. Arguments against God. Okay. So we're going to do what they call the pars destrans, or the destructive part. Like, what would be all the arguments against God? And there's a lot of them. We have some based on the insufficient explanations of religions. Then we have arguments against, directly against God, which could be either due to an incoherence in the concept of God, on the part of the self, or on the part of those who believe it. Lack of evidence, God's not necessary, and the problem of evil. So there's a lot of different things you can do. First, so if I'm an atheist, I can't deny that religion exists, because like it's out there. I mean, I kind of wear the thing, right? So religion exists. The question is, how would you explain it? Or how would you explain it away? Because a religious person say, well, God exists, he founds this religion, and hence we're religious, right? So, Feuerbach says, God is only a projection of our own humanity, but deprived of our limitations, that is idealized. Right? He says, a no to God is a yes to man. Right? Sometimes religion seems to be, we just project all our hopes and dreams on some God instead of just fixing our situation ourselves. Right? He has the famous phrase, homo homini deus est, man is to man God. So basically he just thinks God is just man, but Superman, like made perfect and great and omnipotent and everything. And then Nietzsche says, which is it? Is man one of God's blunders, or is God one of man's? Because obviously, if God doesn't exist, the concept of God has to be made from somewhere. Well, it has to be made up from man, right? That would have to be the source of it. Marx thinks that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the opium of the people that makes its suffering tolerable. This is actually interesting because back in Marx's day, they would have these things called opium dens. Right? You'd go into this room. I guess today, now would be considered hotboxing, I guess would be the term, but opium, right? And you just go in there and you're just in a whole other world. I haven't tried it, but that's what Marx says. So basically, his fundamental claim is that religious people don't care about this world since they're always going to, they're going to go to heaven anyways, right? So why care about this world? I find this particularly sad considering Marx and Marxism being at basically the root of so many deaths last century, with communism. So I don't know who was caring more about this world, the religious people or the Marxists. And if you just look at religious people or just the Catholic faith, but obviously all Christians and a lot of other people, there is no other institutions done more for people, sick people, schools for the ignorant, for lepers. I mean, it's very clear that religious people care about this world. Then we have Freud. Thinks that God is just the result of a collective neurosis or an infantile fantasy. And Douglas Adams kind of sums it up, Is it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it, right? It's kind of mystical, magical way of the world. And that's what Freud thinks. Oh, we'll go with Freud. So, I want to say something real quick about these psychological attacks, right? It's something I was talking earlier about. It's really easy to see a religious person and say, oh, you only do that because you guys are ignorant or you guys are affected by psychology. You just want to go to heaven. You're like mad with this world. It's like, yeah, you can psychologize the religious person, but you can psychologize the atheist as well. You don't want to deal with a God who tells you how to live. If God doesn't exist, as we saw before, you can do whatever the heck you want. But there are psychological incentives both ways. And ultimately, the psychological attack, either for atheism or against atheism or for God or against, doesn't prove whether God exists or not. You're talking about the person who thinks about God, but not whether God exists. We need to get to the arguments themselves. And now we're going to go with another argument. This is basically that there's not evidence for God. Now, when we say evidence, normally what we're thinking is scientific evidence, right? So the scientific method necessarily follows what's called the verification principle, or scientism. Basically, all true knowledge is empirical. We can sense it, we can see it, we can measure it, right? That's what science is all about. It's based on this principle. A sentence, to have meaning, must be capable in principle of being empirically verified. So if I say, I don't know, the sun is however many degrees hot, in principle, I could go and measure how hot the sun is. Maybe not by going there because it'd be a little bit too hot, but the way it affects the earth and the distance and I don't know, I'm not a scientist, right? But there's definitely ways to do that, in principle at least, right? So it has to be empirically verified or verifiable. Does anyone see a problem with this principle? What's the problem with this principle? It's not a problem with science, but with this principle.
There's lots of things that can't be proven.
Okay. They would just say that no, those things just don't exist. It's self-refuting. Can this principle, this sentence, in principle, be verified empirically? No. You can't measure this. This is a philosophical principle, right? So it's self-refuting, right? The very basis of saying that all things have to be empirically verifiable is not empirically verifiable. So this actually, they realized, there was called the Circle of Vienna back in the 1920s and 30s. And they were all about this. Basically philosophy was reduced to just reflecting on science because science is amazing, right? It's like, yes, science is very amazing. I'm going to use all these things, right? And but the principle itself undermines itself. So they're like, how do we go beyond that? Because this can't be it. So I think a good image for this is if you have a guy who has a metal detector and he's looking for coins at the beach, Well, he's going to find coins because, But what if you say like, oh no, but now we're going to do the search for the Holy Grail, right? The cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper, but it's made of wood. But you just keep trying. And he's going with his metal detector. Well, he's never going to find the cup because it's wood with a metal detector, right? So what is the method we're using to talk about God? Well, this is the wrong method, because if God is not empirical because he's spiritual, he's not made of matter like this, well, the empirical method is the wrong method, right? You can't tell me that some wooden thing doesn't exist because you didn't see it on your metal detector. So, I think this is a fun one. Who created God, right? It could seem like a really good question, right? Although I put here Facebook atheists who didn't reflect too much. But the problem is, what is the concept of God? The uncaused cause. So if you ask who created, or the uncreated creator, who created God, it's like asking who created the uncreated creator. It doesn't even make sense, the question itself, right? So if God is the ultimate principle, it doesn't make sense to ask, well, what caused that principle? Well, then it wouldn't be the ultimate principle, right? That's what we're talking about. The question you could say, does an ultimate principle exist? That is a good question. Like, is there some uncreated creator? But you can't ask what created the uncreated creator. That doesn't make sense. Here's another good one. Religious people are arrogant, thinking that their ideas are right and everyone else is wrong. But if you're an atheist, you think you're right and that religious people are wrong. So just thinking you're right is arrogant, we've got a lot of arrogance going all over for everybody, Christianity comes from ignorant people who didn't have any science. This is true. Obviously, Christianity was founded by Jesus, who was checking out, making sure I'm not doing anything wrong over here. Science isn't the principle to understand about God. Now, philosophy was around, and the Jews definitely thought about God and a lot of different things. So it's not necessarily an argument against God's existence. Okay. Yeah, we're going to go a little bit faster. Okay, here's a good one. Another lack of emphasis. This is an exemplification of what I said before about the scientific method, right? So we have the Russian astronaut Yuri Gagarin, who's the first guy to go to space, and he said, probably in Russian, "I have been in the heavens and have not found God." What was he expecting to see in the heavens? Some guy with a big, long, white beard, just kind of hanging out there. No, that's not God. Here's another one. I have no need of this hypothesis. It's not necessary. This would be a good argument against what's called the God of the gaps. So let's say I'm a scientist and I'm doing my thing, and I don't know how to explain how in evolution we got from this species to the next species. God did it. Poof. No more problems. Well, that's called the God of the gaps. It's because you're using God to fix a particular problem in your science just because you couldn't figure out your science yet. Well, that's not God. God doesn't just kind of fix things all the time just because it doesn't work out. No, God's on a whole other plane. He's on a whole other level. So yes, it would make sense for, I think it was Laplace, one of the scientists, talking to Napoleon when he was explaining his view of the world. He didn't have God as just one more cause among the different chain of causes in the world. God's not just one more in the chain. He's the very basis of the whole chain, right? It's on a metaphysical level, not just on a physical level, right? Scientists say it's not necessary for any physical calculation. Yeah, within physics. But the question then would be, but who created physics itself, or the principles of physics? What's at the very bottom of all physics? It's a different thing. You can have Darwin, evolution apparently just answered everything. Well, first, evolution doesn't answer the existence of the world. It would answer the existence of life. Right? So even that doesn't explain everything. The good thing about evolution, this could be for another topic as well, can you have Christian evolutionism? It really depends what you understand by evolution. Now, if you mean by evolution a process that is completely devoid of God, where God doesn't exist, well, that would be a problem, right? But if you can think of evolution as a process of mutations, everything, but it's also directed by God as the first cause of all things, you can put those together. And then we have the problem of evil. No? If evil exists, God does not exist. No? This is interesting, he puts it, because if God is omnipotent, good, and existing, you can't have all those three and him with the problem of evil, apparently. You have to say he's not omnipotent, that's why he's good, he exists, but he couldn't fix evil, right? Or you say God is omnipotent, but he's bad, so he likes evil. That could be a possibility. So he goes into different possibilities of God, and he says, ultimately, God can't exist because evil exists, right? Ooh, there. Here's another one by David Vianney. Gods don't kill people. People with gods kill people. And then we have, religion has caused more misery to all mankind in every stage of human history than any other single idea. I find that very interesting. And the most prolific source of violence in history is religion. Sam Harris. This is actually a myth. It's the myth of religion being the cause of all wars, or almost all wars. There's a really big book called the Encyclopedia of All Wars. And according to those authors, they went through religion directly as a cause of war would be around 7% of all of them, directly. Because the thing is, sometimes you can kind of put a religious veneer over a war, right? But when religion was the cause, it's 7. And if you take out Islam, it's 2%, right? So that would be Hindus and Christians and Jews and whatever. So it's the idea that religion is at the basis of all wars is definitely just historically not true, right? And the thing that people with gods kill people, people without gods kill people too. So, people are killing people all over the place. So maybe it's not just because of religion, right? And all this is based on a misunderstanding of God. Here we're at the visions of God, right? So we have an erroneous view of God where God is basically just one more entity among others. So this is maybe what the Russian astronaut was looking for, one more God, one more thing floating in the universe. Laplace would be he'd just be one more in the chain of causes. No. God is ipsum esse. He's being itself. He's at the very basis of the existence of all things. He's the condition of possibility for everything. And there's another erroneous view. The bigger God is, the smaller we are. It's the competition view between God and man or creatures. But what we should have is the burning bush view. God, the fire, doesn't consume the bush, but makes it more resplendent, right? So God is not threatened by the creature, but he's more like a mother who sees her children flourish and is happy, right? Because she was part of that process, right? God is, what was it by Irenaeus? Gloria Dei homo vivens. The glory of God is man fully alive. Bishop Barron loves this thing, and it's very true. God, since he's on another level of existence, he's the cause of all things, not in the chain, he's not in competition with this creature, right? He doesn't have to compete. So now we're going to get into some arguments for the existence of God. First, we'll do the kalam argument, then the contingency, and then the moral. So this one will definitely be the easiest one because there's only 3 steps, right? Then things get a little bit more complicated with contingency and moral as well. So we're going from easier to more difficult. The kalam argument actually comes from an Arabic term, which I believe means discourse, right? And it was popularized in the West by St. Bonaventure, right? Interesting enough, St. Thomas Aquinas did not like this argument, and we'll see why. But there are 3 parts to it. 2 premises and a conclusion, straight out logic, right? Everything that comes into existence or begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, Big Bang, 14 billion or whatever years ago. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. It's a very humble argument. We didn't get into all the, characteristics of this cause, but it has a cause. Now, the beautiful thing about logic is that if you accept these 2 premises, the conclusion necessarily follows. There's no way out of it. So you have to attack either 1 or 2. The problem is you don't really want to attack any of these. The first one, everything that comes into existence has a cause. If you say, no, things can just start existing without a cause, it would be worse than magic, right? Because at least with magic you have a magician, There's the hat from which But just things which poof, rabbits, appearing at random. Like the whole scientific method would fall apart, right? Like if there's no reason why things happen, then there's no reason to ask why things happen. And the other part of it, that the universe actually came into existence, this is interesting. This is obviously the more contested part. And this is where St. Thomas has problems. Many before thought, like the Greeks, thought the world was eternal. Right? The interesting thing is the Greeks still believed in God and thought the world was eternal for other reasons, namely the contingents, whom we'll see later on, or movement. Father Lemaitre, who was a Jesuit, I believe, a Jesuit priest in the last century, he was the one that kind of came up with the Big Bang Theory. He obviously didn't call it the Big Bang Theory. That was supposed to be a, it wasn't a sitcom back in the day, but, right? This was supposed to be like a name to kind of make fun of it, but then it kind of stuck. So now we're stuck with Big Bang Theory. But the idea that all things come from one point or one part, and then it expands out. This here understood because it's actually interesting if you look at the science of it. If you look at other galaxies, there's something called the red shift, right? So in sound, we have something called the Doppler effect, right? So if you have the siren coming, it seems to be higher, the pitch, when it's coming towards you because it's like compressing those waves. And when it leaves you, it's elongating them. So there's something called the blue shift and the red shift, right? So if light was coming to you, it would shift blue, which is like a higher frequency of light. If it's going away, it would shift red. Now, the interesting thing they saw is that most of the galaxies, there's a few exceptions, but most of them seem to be speeding away from us. So the idea is that the universe is expanding, right? Now, if it's expanding, the idea is that, well, if you go back in history, it's like it would go little by little all the way back to the very beginning, right? And that's where you have the Big Bang. So that's kind of a little bit of the science behind the Big Bang Theory. And this was interesting because this was confirmed by a non-Christian, Alexander Vilenkin, who said, all the evidence we have points to the universe having a beginning. This he did, if I'm not mistaken, at an anniversary celebrating Stephen Hawking's. So with a bunch of other scientists, and he started out. And he wasn't obviously doing it for Christian or theist apologetics, right? This is just science. Now, are we going to get into this? No, we'll go back. Here's the thing with the Kalam argument. For it to work, you need both premises to work. Now, since this premise is based on science, and science is fallible, or is like it can be wrong, what if in the future we do another experiment and now we find that the world was eternal? Well, then this argument wouldn't work. There's, amongst philosophers though, there are debate. Some people say that, okay, maybe this is science, but philosophy itself could prove that you can't have an infinite past. St. Thomas wouldn't agree. He thinks you could technically have an infinite past. It's just one moment after the other. He thinks you could do it. Bonaventure thinks you can't. A lot of people, it's a big debate. I'm not going to go into it. But the beauty of this thing is that, at least for now, this is definitely the science. And it's the easiest of all the arguments because it's just really clear. The world had an existence. Things need to have a cause. The world has a cause, right? But there are other arguments for God's existence. So here they necessarily follow. Now the thing is, this we can kind of take more out of this argument, because if we start asking ourselves, what would be the characteristics of this cause of the universe, right? Well, it obviously couldn't be in the universe itself, because we need the cause of the universe, so it would have to be transcendent and immaterial. Also, it would have to, it's made something extremely complex and large, therefore it would have to be extremely powerful and intelligent. There's actually another argument that William A. Craig brings out, is that if it had a beginning in time, it couldn't have been caused by nature, because if it was something like naturally existing, it would be from all eternity. Like, why would it change, right? And if it was by chance, well, like, what would be the chance it would be based on, right? It'd have to be made by a person, because only people are free to choose to start something in a particular moment, right? So he thinks that with this argument, you can even come ultimately to a personal, all-powerful, intelligent, transcendent, immaterial being, which for me sounds a heck of a lot like God. So here's a little review. Everything that comes into existence has a cause. The universe came into existence, therefore the universe has a cause. Now we're going to get into a little bit more complicated one called the contingency argument, but this one is like much more sound philosophically because it doesn't depend on science, right? So this would work whether tomorrow they come out and say, hey, the world's eternal. Everything that exists in one of two ways. Either it's contingent, hence it depends on other things for existence, or it's necessary. It must exist and does not depend on anything else. Now, contingent things would be like contingent not necessary or corruptible things or things that begin to exist. Stones, animals, mountains, us, things that began to exist and may cease to exist. And well, if we believe in the Big Bang or whatever thing else, apparently everything began to exist. And everything, through the second thing of thermodynamics, will apparently cease to exist. So, then you can say, well, what about matter and energy, right? The famous thing, they're never created, they're only transformed. Well, even there, the fact that they're in one particular configuration now is not necessary. They could be in another configuration, right? So they're not completely necessary. So it seems like almost everything is contingent. But what would happen if everything were contingent? Well, then everything would depend on everything else. What would be at the beginning? If there were no necessary first thing, there would be an infinite regress, and nothing would exist in the first place, right? If everything depends on, then it would just all eventually fall apart, and there wouldn't be anything there. You need something at the beginning that's necessary that holds all the contingents together, right? So there's actually an interesting book here. This is the typical regress thing you'll see in St. Thomas Aquinas with his 5 ways, which I didn't get into because it's also, you have to do a little bit more philosophy for those ones. But this is a really important principle, the idea of the infinite regress. And they have a good example of the great book of explanations, right? So let's say there's a great book of explanations and I want it. So I heard my mom had it, so I go ask my mom. And she says, no, actually your dad has it. So I go ask my dad. He's like, well, actually, I lent it to your cousin. The cousin's like, well, I lent it to the busboy, whatever. I lent it to... If I just make an infinite chain of people that lent the book, apparently, but if no one actually has the book, I'll never get the book of great explanations. So if everything depends on everything else for existence, but there's nothing that has it in itself, then the whole thing falls apart. Another good example is, let's say I have a chain. And this part of the link, is linked to the other link, linked to the other link, and it just keeps going up. But what happens if I don't have a roof? Just the links just keep going. Well, there's nothing to found the entire chain. It will fall necessarily. It doesn't matter if you have infinite links. If there's nothing that sustains it, it'll fall apart, right? This has to do with another funny story of one person was talking about God's existence ever, and the other person says, no, it's well, we understood in our tribal religion is that the earth is on the back of a turtle. And he's like, well, what holds up the turtle? It's like, well, another turtle. And what holds up the other turtle? Well, it's just turtles all the way down, right? All the way down to where? It's like having infinite turtles still doesn't hold up the world, right? Therefore, there must be something that necessarily exists and does not depend on something else, but from which everything else depends, and this we call God, would be the perfectly necessary being, right? So this is interesting because it doesn't depend on the universe's age. So this is not an argument saying that I exist because my parents and my parents exist because my grandparents and all the way back. No, this is talking about things right now. It's like I exist because I have this configuration, I have these body parts, whatever, and then those are in their way because of the laws of physics. The laws of physics because of more fundamental particles and who knows what, and you get all the way to the Bose-Higgs zone or whatever. But ultimately, the question is, why do the laws of physics exist themselves right now? Something necessary has to be at the basis of that, right? And that we call God. The moral argument. It's relatively simple. If God does not exist, objective morality does not exist. But objective morality does exist, therefore God exists. This can get a little bit more difficult because you will have a lot of pushback probably on the objective morality nowadays because it's so much easier to say, no, everyone does their own thing and it's all great. It's like, well, do you really believe that? You believe that until someone steals your lunch. Then you don't believe. So, first one. If God does not exist, objective morality does not exist. So, morality has to do with what's right or wrong. And the question is not so much, can people who don't believe in God... How would I put this? Okay. The question is not if you're an atheist, you can't be a moral person. That's not what we're saying here. The question is, what's the foundation for your morality? Is your morality coherent? Because you could live a morality for no reason, right? It's like, if there's no ultimate good and evil, why are you living this way? It's like, well, because this is the way I've always lived. This is how other people live. It's like, you can definitely be a very moral atheist, right? So that's not what we're talking about here. The question is, what's the foundation of this? Now, there could be multiple foundations. We could say it's either based on people. You have relativism of the individual, it's like everyone says their own truth and like it's all based on you. Or the collective, you can have cultural relativism. It's based on the culture. You could also say it's nature, just nature itself, we learned from science, whatever. Or it has a transcendent foundation. These are the possible foundations for morality. We're going to go through them one by one. People. Well, people obviously is very difficult because first we can even within one person change our mind. So either morality is changing every day when I wake up in the morning, now I'm going to consider it okay to do this one thing. Well, now I'm going to say something else. We're very changeable, very fickle. And then we have the problem of what if one person doesn't agree with someone else? Well, if I think, killing people I don't like is okay, I'm sure the guy I'm going to kill doesn't like that. Well, he thinks that's wrong. Well, then who's right? Am I right or is he right? Where is the basis of morality if we're both right? You have contradictions, right? So it's obviously very difficult at just the personal level. But what about the collective? Even if Hitler had conquered the entire world and everyone thought killing the Jews was correct, it still would be wrong, right? Just because everyone thinks something doesn't make it right. And you see this very clearly with obviously the Holocaust, but you can also see it with torturing innocent children. It's no matter if the entire world thought it were okay, it would still be wrong, right? And this is in the fiber of our moral sensibility, we understand this, right? Ultimately, there has to be some objective morality, certain norms that you just can't do, right? Things that are intrinsically wrong. So it can't be based on the individual, and it can't be based on culture. What if we make it based on nature? This seems okay. We have a problem, though. Hume talks about this as the is-ought problem. Just because things are in a certain way doesn't mean they necessarily have to be in another way, right? Nature can tell us that, it hurts when I punch someone, but it can't tell me not to punch someone, right? Sorry for the very violent examples, right? But what about evolution, right? There's a lot of talk about evolution's relation to morality. There's some interesting things you can see there, but evolution also doesn't work. Right? Evolution tells us that certain things help us to survive and perpetuate our species, such as making friends instead of enemies and a lot of other things, right? If you do this, there's more chances you will survive, right? But it doesn't tell us why we should survive and perpetuate our species. It just says that. It doesn't say why. It doesn't have an actual moral principle, right? It's well, what if we just want, all humanity to go, extinct? We tell Elon Musk to stop working on getting us to Mars. We're just going to die here. No. There is other reasonings that can get us to these things, but evolution itself can't. It just says how things happen. Therefore, there must be a transcendent foundation, right? Something that would be the basis and source of objective morality. Something not contingent, like the non-contingent necessary thing that we talked about in the last argument, right? So, even some of the atheists can see this, right? If atheism is true, there would be no good or evil. There would be nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Right? There would be no foundation for good and evil because there would be no objective good. Therefore, objective morality exists. Right? So this is stealing the lunch, right? You can be a relativist when things work out, but ultimately when your bank account gets hit, then you stop being a relativist. The bank's well, for me, you had less money in your bank account. It's no, for me, what? No, I had that money. It's not relative. The number was it? So relativism tends to go away when you hit things that you really care about, right? Which is normally money for a lot of people, right? So if morality were relative, there's also another problem. You'd have something, but you can't have progress. If morality is based on culture, all you have is changes, but not progress. So we had slavery before, and now we don't have slavery. What we'd want to say is yes, we actually advance as a civilization. But if morality is just based on the collective, we haven't advanced. We've just changed because it was good to have slavery before because everyone believed it because it's based on the collective. And now we don't, and it's okay because it's based on the collective, right? You can't have progress if there is nothing outside of the collective that founds morality, right? Therefore God exists, right? There must be some transcendent good, the giver of the moral law, which is objective and eternal, right? So, review. If God does not exist, objective morality does not exist. Objective morality does exist because we saw it can't be based on nature, it can't be based on the individual, and it can't be based on the collective. Therefore, God exists. There we go. And that's the 3 arguments. And that's the end of the conference. Thanks so much. Apparently speaking English is a lot faster than Spanish for me, because normally this takes like an hour and 15 minutes in Spanish. I did cut out the argument from fine-tuning, though, which is too bad. But questions? Now we have at least 10 minutes for questions. Sure, go ahead.
Sorry. I've spent time here with the dog. But the questions on morality seem very human.
Uh-huh.
What about gods and animals? Because you're talking about the morality, you're talking about the social, you're talking about the evolution. And that seems a very human perspective.
Okay.
I'm just thinking about the dog I've got in my hand here, you know. And I don't think he has those same thoughts. He just needs to procreate. And you know, I've seen how dogs do that. But you know what I mean? How does that morality apply to the bigger picture, the bigger world?
Oh, for sure. Okay. No, yeah. Well, first, I mean, dogs themselves don't have morality. That's why we don't, send them to jail or do, we don't process dogs, right? Because they don't have rationality. And the idea for morality, you need responsibility. For responsibility, you have to be free, right? We could have gone into the whole problem of freedom, right? Which is another thing, right? If you're not free, well, then how do we even have morality? So for a dog in itself, I mean, first it doesn't think like we do, so it wouldn't really care about these arguments. But the question is, do dogs fit into our moral view of the world, perhaps, would be the question, right? And they do. I mean, from a theist point of view, God created men, women, dogs, horses, the world, created everything, right? And if you look at the catechism, right, we have to also respect all creation, right? I mean, Pope Francis is really good about this, with the whole idea of like an integral ecology, right? So it's definitely something that we'd have to. And if you, in the catechism itself, it says, like, if you mistreat animals, you're also being morally not up to par, right? This is part of who we are as human, as custode, how do you say that? As custodians of creation. There's a really beautiful, actually, image of the idea of humanity kind of like as priests of creation. Since the dog doesn't have an intellect to know and love God directly, in a certain sense, by him participating in humanity and humanity being able to love God, we raise up even lower life forms in a certain sense of dogs and horses or whatever into a higher thing, right? If you look at this in the Mass, for example, the fact that we use all these other material things in the sacrifice of the Mass, in this participating in Christ's sacrifice, these things are kind of subsumed into this higher level of being. That's what I would say for that. Any other questions? Sure.
So all of this shows that there is a God, but how would you argue that it's like a personal God who actually cares about individuals?
That's a very good question, because some people's like, okay, we got to this cause of the universe, right? Oh, that's great. That doesn't sound a lot like the Bible. You have the problem of like the God of the philosophers and the God of Abraham and Jacob, right? It's like, well, maybe there's more than one cause of the universe. How do we know there's only one God, right? And then how is this God? We went to a little bit with the Kalam argument. Like we saw that he must be transcendent, non-material, very powerful, right? We still didn't prove he was one. Now, this is a really interesting thing, because Dawkins criticizes the 5 ways of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's like, well, you got to some kind of cause, but we don't really know what it is. It's like, well, Dawkins, you saw question 2 of the Summa, but there's question 3 all the way to 26 talking about all the characteristics of God, right? So there are a lot more arguments for God's existence, and how is he? Is he the summum bonum, the supreme good? Is he true? Is he one? Is he, and we go into eternal, immovable. There's a bunch of characteristics we can know even from philosophy, right? Because, and the whole process is okay, we start with what we know, which is this reality. We don't have an intuition directly into God's existence, We start with the senses, and then we reason from up there, right? So we know that things exist. We know that they're contingent. They need to be founded on something that's necessary. The question is, if that thing was if that necessary thing, which we call God, if he had any kind of potentiality in him, like he could change or do something else, well, then he wouldn't be God because he needs something else to change him, right? So he has to have being. It's kind of going into the more philosophy thing, right? But when you understand that he has to have being and the fullness, he has to have all the perfections, right? Because if he lacked something, then he could get something from something else, and then he wouldn't be God. And this is how he gets into the idea that God must be one. Because if there were two divine principles, right, how would we distinguish them? One would have to have something that the other doesn't have. But if the other doesn't have it, then it's not God. Because God has to have all the perfections. Therefore, there can only be one God. Now, we could probably do like another conference on the different characteristics of God, because it's a lot of arguments and a lot of stuff. That would go a little bit further away from there. But yes, there's definitely philosophical arguments that kind of flesh out how we understand God, right? But it does get a little bit more philosophical. Sure.
First of all, I want to thank you for the nice speech, but I think that what you're trying to do is kind of impossible. You're
Okay.
trying to convince people or to show with arguments, from philosophy and everything else that God exists, but you cannot prove it. You have to believe or to know that God exists, And this is kind of a paradox that we're doing tonight. I think it's really nice, really, and you're really trying hard, but
Let's try harder.
you have to know that God is there and believe and find for yourself the way to find God in you and in all creation. So I'm a Christian, I believe in God, and I know He's there. But the thing is that you cannot. What we are doing tonight is it's very nice for people like maybe they want to have talk about there is God, there is not God, what you said before, there is creation, and some people like Darwin, they try to do this evolution theory, but it doesn't work. Everybody knows today that it was wrong, but anyway, those people believed in him, because there was a missing link, was with Darwin, and he was trying hard, also like to put a system of logic, into something that you cannot explain.
Okay.
But nowadays we know that he was wrong. So it was something from, back a few hundred years ago. And what we are trying as human beings, because we cannot grasp, the God principle, the spirit principle, we try always to, argue with the philosophy, with digging and stuff, we try to explain things, but actually we cannot. But thank you very much for everything. It was pretty close,
0.9. We'll get you next time. No.
No, that is God. That's what I think.
No, for sure. No, I mean, that's definitely a really interesting point. Like, a lot of people think that God, if we're talking about God, we're necessarily outside of our league. Just like you can't prove or disprove God exists. I personally don't agree with that. I think you can. At least a Catholic, if you look at just from like a dogmatic point of view, in De Filius, if I'm not mistaken, which is a document from Vatican I, so this is like way back in the day, it says that you can prove God exists. So as a Catholic, technically you'd have to believe that God's existence is provable. The question is, what do you mean by proof? Right? So obviously we're not doing a mathematical proof. We're not doing a scientific proof. We're doing a philosophical proof. Right? So the scientific, as we know, we need something that's empirical, whatever. Mathematical, well, you need numbers, and I don't think I said too many numbers here. Right? So it's a different kind of proof. Now, the question is, to talk about God's existence, you have to have a certain faith in human reason, right? Now, you could say that the very object, God himself, because he's transcendent, is outside of human reason's capacity. And in a certain sense, yes, we cannot have a perfect understanding of God. There's a famous argument for the existence of God called the ontological argument, which has a long history and different ways of doing it, but let's say the founder of it, not under that name, was Anselm of Canterbury. And it's interesting that St. Thomas Aquinas himself disagrees with that argument. The argument has to do with the very concept of God. Right? God is the most perfect thing, or that from which there's nothing greater. Now, he could either exist in my mind or in reality. If he's only my mind, then he's obviously not the greatest, because I could think of something also in reality. Therefore, he has to be outside. He has to exist. St. Thomas didn't like that. He didn't think it followed, because we don't have this direct understanding of God's essence, right? But the thing about these arguments is they start from our experience of the world. And from our experience of the world, we see that things can't explain themselves. And that we get to this idea that there must be something that explains this world. So, you can criticize the arguments, for sure. But I do think that they are convincing, especially the contingency one. The morality one, I think, is also convincing, although it takes a little bit more because you have to understand like the whole idea of objective reality, and that gets a little bit more complicated, right? And there's a bunch of other proofs. If you go into St. Thomas directly with the 5 ways, the contingency would be kind of like the third way of the 5, but the first one would be from motion, the second one from causality. And I think the second one for me is the strongest. It's just things don't explain themselves in this world. You need some kind of principle that founds all the contingency and all the different movements and changes in this world. At least that's how I see it. Now, there's another part. A proof isn't a proof just because it convinces everyone. I mean, we could look at Gödel's proof for the, what was it? Famous one for set theory. Like, you could tell me that proof, but I wouldn't be convinced because I'd have no idea what he's talking about, right? So that could be one reason. Or I could have reasons to not want to accept that proof, right? Proof just means that it is logically sound from the premises to the conclusion, right? So proofs don't always convince everyone. If you just look at the history of philosophy, no one's convinced by anything, right? So there's definitely a problem of that aspect. But that doesn't necessarily mean that in itself it doesn't work. It just might mean that it's not convincing to you. So there is that aspect of it. Any other question? Sure.
I guess the most convincing argument against God for me would be the morality one, or
problem of evil?
Why is it necessary to believe in God, I guess? And I would always hit back with like, well, we need objectively speaking, like we need a measurement of what is good, what is bad, and I think that leads us to God. However, I think the argument that we have evolved this way, like the one on evolution, is the most convincing to me. I still don't necessarily understand how you can argue against that. I guess I'm not necessarily convinced entirely. I believe in God, but I think it makes sense to say that we have adapted, and religion itself is just a product of that adaptation. Like, we're trying to explain something. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm sorry.
No, I get that. That's connected a little bit to the other things I said about, like, if you can always attack the reasons why people believe in something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that something either exists or doesn't exist. So there is something in logic called the genetic fallacy. It was like, well, because you said something, that must be wrong. Because you're a bigot or you're a whatever. So just because the reasons you got there may be wrong doesn't mean that thing is right or wrong. So I'm going to apply it to evolution, right? Just because, let's just say, perhaps religion, I don't know, I'd have to go into the detail, religion could be evolutionarily positive, doesn't mean that religion is based only on evolution. It could just be we're lucky that evolution also helps us understand God's existence, right? In itself, doesn't attack God's existence or not. It just could say, we think de facto, in fact, this way because of evolution, right? That's one way I would talk about it. Any other questions? Yeah?
There is also some hypothesis in evolutionary psychology that defend the God hypothesis, that human beings are developed to search for God.
Mm-hmm.
And also I did evolutionary psychology. When they do some experiments, if people have the feeling that has been watched, they tend to behave better because it creates a campus of morality.
Mm-hmm.
Than people that feel that is not watched by no one.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's you can see. There's benefits to being religious, right? From a psychological point of view. Now, does that prove God exists? No. I mean, maybe it's just a placebo effect, right? Does it prove God doesn't exist? Also no, right? So, in a certain sense, the psychological aspect of it can't really say too much about whether God exists or not. Now, for me, I think the fundamental thing is if you wanted to prove God didn't exist, first you have to destroy all the arguments for God. You have to show how they're wrong or inconclusive. Or you can do straight to the jugular and go with the problem of evil, basically saying the very concept of God is incompatible with something in this world. Therefore, since this does exist in the world, God can't exist. And there's the problem of, there's the logical problem of, it's actually interesting that the logical problem of like the apparent contradiction between these two concepts, almost no philosophers think you can hold that. It's very difficult because you'd have to, I mean, well, I don't want to spoil the Ever Conference, right? But it gets really complicated too. But there's the logical problem of evil, then there's the evidential. It's like, well, okay, maybe God could explain, there could be a reason why God permits some evil, but there's just way too much evil in this world for God to exist, right? There's no way he could explain. That's the evidential problem. And then you have the emotional problem of evil, right? And like, you could be philosophizing all day, but if someone lost a child, it's kind of like the arguments going back. It's like, what are you going to tell them, right? In a certain sense, we don't want to hear logical arguments or something St. Thomas Aquinas said, right? So, that would be a part. And you can go into each of these things and there are reasons and answers, right? But that's definitely the problem of evil, right? And then within the problem of evil, there's also the problem of divine hiddenness, which is a form of the problem of evil. Kind of like, why does God want us to believe in him? Why can't he just kind of come out and say, hey, I exist, right? Or just like, move the stars around and say, God exists. Like, why is it difficult? Why can there be people that don't believe in God, right? That's the problem of divine hiddenness. It's also part of the problem of evil. So, last question, sure?
So there's a reason you guys study for so long. You can't condense it into 1 hour. But just from what you said, Massimo, and going back to the empirical proof,
Mm-hmm.
where does actually the church stand on, maybe we just don't have knowledge of how to prove how God exists, not that he exists, but how he exists through future physics and future knowledge. You know what I mean?
One of the things that physics can't tell us about how God is and stuff. No, but in principle.
I mean, we thought the world was flat once. Maybe
Yeah, so I see that, but the thing is
we
that
don't know what we don't know.
unless you know that you're on two totally different planes, right? It's like, I can't prove mathematics from physics or something like that. It's on a different thing. It's abstract, right? Even if, like, let's say we're like some super advanced race and we have so much better understanding of physics and quantum physics and string theory and like theories that we haven't even thought about yet. In principle, those can't speak about God because God is not physical. And insofar as he's not physical, if science, which is based on the physical and the experimental, just can't even, in principle, talk about him. It's the problem of the metal detector and the wood. No matter how strong your metal detector is, you have like the best metal detector, you can like do metal detecting things on Pluto. Well, but if God's a wooden thing, sorry? Yeah, there's a wood detector. It's called philosophy, though. That would be this. No, I'm not. That's what I would say. Like, there is a proper method for that proper object of study. It's philosophy, right? Obviously, you can believe in God through faith. That's like another method. So you like 3 methods, right? Science, well, that doesn't work. Philosophy can tell you things about God, but also faith can tell you things about God, right? And actually, faith can tell you things that philosophy can't tell you about God. So this is important. When we talk about, what could philosophy tell us? Well, it can't tell us that God's a Trinity. It can't tell us that Jesus is God. It can't tell us that, God became incarnate or anything. No, that goes beyond philosophy, and that's totally in the sphere of faith. So there are some things that we believe that you can either believe or know by philosophy, but there's some things you can't know by philosophy. You can only believe them. Trinity, the Eucharist, Christ's incarnation, for example. Those would be things that are totally outside of the purview of philosophy.
The reason is like quite a hot topic. I'm sure everyone else here agrees. I've been in so many conversations about this and lost every one of them. I've never been able to hold my own in one of these conversations with an atheist. And this is why I'm asking you these questions.
Yeah, sure.
It'd be nice to bring far too much
I would recommend going on YouTube. You can see a lot of debates, especially those from William Lane Craig. He can hold his own with an atheist, for sure. I mean, that's for sure. And I'm sure, like, if we had a political debate about something else, perhaps I would also fail if I had some political. It's just part of, yeah.
Recently, I found myself in discussion with people who like, I don't know, like, if you have any ideas for, like, how you would approach that. And somebody else was, like, listening on the conversation, and I asked what they thought, and they were like, well, I think you're getting philosophical, which is just going to go where philosophy always goes, which is just in a circle, and you're never going to prove anything.
Yeah.
So, would there be, like, could you think of, like, any other way, I guess, to try and...
There is the experiential way, right? Or the way of faith, right? I mean, not everyone, basically, very few people, I guess you could say, believe in God just because of arguments, right? Now, this is not supposed to take the place of faith, right? They're just further supports of faith. And if someone doesn't want to hear philosophical arguments, they don't want to hear philosophical arguments, you know? It's like, you have to respect them in their own individuality as well. Maybe it's like, okay, well, maybe that's not the avenue, but why don't you just come to our prayer circle or something, or come to this activity, and maybe by experiencing a little bit the life of faith, God can, touch their hearts through something else, right? I mean, we're all free. No matter how many arguments I can give you about something, right? Yeah?
I was just to say one thing. At one time in history, it was religion and science was one. Long time ago. 150. But then science and religion split. And this is the problem that we have in our time and in our time and modern century. And in 100 years, 200 years, we will have the same problem because at some time religion and science must come together, and then we have a totally different.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. The relation between religion and science. Sure.
You cannot prove something by argument or by philosophy. It's like a tool, to repair a motor, an engine, You try and stuff, but if you don't have the right key, it doesn't work, That's also with philosophy. I'm a big fan of Plato, Plato and Socrates, or Camus, and so I saw you have really nice, quotes from a lot of smart men and geniuses and stuff. It's all nice, but it's at the end it boils down to faith, belief, and knowing. If you experience God, then you know that He's there, then you believe. If you are not believing and you don't know, then you can try with argument, with talk with people and stuff, with philosophy, with all kinds of things, but it doesn't work at the end because we are human and we move through this, reality with our five senses, and God and all godly, all this, I say it is God energy. Let's say talk about this godly energy, this creator energy. God is something that we cannot explain with our five senses. We cannot measure, and we cannot, at the end, it stays by 99%. You try hard, and that's why I thank you. It was great to hear that you are doing a great job tonight. But at the end, you have to know if He's there or if you believe. This is the only thing that remains. You can talk 100 years about God, and you will not grasp it. But it's not in this dimension, and it's bigger than whatever you can imagine or see. Since you are human, we are all human, and it's very difficult actually. Very fantastic.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would push back a little bit on that. That, for me, is definitely the position of Kant. If we go to Immanuel Kant, the idea that, and he actually says it, I reduced the spectrum of reason to leave space for faith, which would be kind of a little bit of what you're saying, like, reason basically only do with what we can touch and see, right? Well, the five senses, whatever, so the other three as well. And but the thing is, you need everything else. You need faith. For angels, soul, God, faith. I have a much more robust, let's say, or wider view of man's reasoning capabilities with philosophy. Now, a lot of people wouldn't agree with me, Kant being one of them, right? And a bunch of other, like Camus, Sartre. There's a whole bunch of people in philosophy that wouldn't agree with me, right? But I definitely have reasons, and I mean, that's why partially my doctorate is going to be on the foundations of knowledge. So this is like kind of part of the thing, like, can you with reason in principle understand that something beyond the physical can be known, right, would be one of the things. So that. Going back to your first point about science and faith, the idea that science and faith were together, yeah?
Physical and metaphysical, maybe you should explain. Something is metaphysical, so you cannot really...
Yeah, I mean, God would be metaphysical, right?
Yeah, that's it. And we are in the physical plane.
Yeah.
So we try to explain something that we never can explain. This is very
Yeah, so that's where I push back, because our soul having an intellect and will, since those are actually spiritual faculties, I would have to argue for that, obviously, right? But as spiritual faculties, in principle, they can know another spiritual thing, which would be God's existence. Now, if you think that our intellect and will, like the empiricists, for example, are not spiritual faculties, then obviously you can't, right? Because it goes beyond the very faculty itself. So we'd have to do a philosophical debate about that, right? But just going back to the idea of science, though, and with this, I think we finish because the pizzas are going to get cold, right? The idea that science and faith are opposed or have moved away from each other, perhaps in many scientists, in their particular mind, yes. But there are many Catholic and Christian scientists today who don't see a contradiction, right? I mentioned one of the biggest ones, Lemaitre, although it's like not today, but like founder of the Big Bang. We have Mendel, founder of modern genetics, right? We have Mendeleev, the guy who did the elements, with the quadro, how you say that? Chart, the elemental chart, right? The chart with all the elements and stuff like that. And like that, you could give many examples of scientists who are also men of faith. So I think we'll leave it at that, and we can move on to the dinner.
Great. So I want to thank you all for coming, and it's great that you're all able to join us for this first event that we're holding of the year, really. So special thanks to Father Adrian for coming all the way from Rome to share this evening with us. And we're going to move into the social aperitivo. So if you have more questions, feel free to bombard Father Adrian with lots of questions. And he's also here pretty much all weekend. So if you want to meet up or talk to him, or personally you're like, something that you really mentioned, I really want to talk to you one-on-one about it. I don't know, I put you on the spot. But if he has time and if you're able to work that out, that's also probably could be possible. I also want to launch and promote the next event, which is going to be the 1st of December. So the 1st of December it's a Thursday, and Father Samir Arvani, who is originally from India and Dubai, but moved to Canada, and presently lives in Rome.
And was born in Germany.
Yeah, exactly. He has a very interesting background, which is also partly why he got so into the study and finished his doctoral thesis. And he's going to give his talk on December 1st, same time, same place. So if you want to join us, it'd be great. It's going to be a really powerful conversation. And it's going to be on the diversity of religions, the plurality of religions, and what Christianity brings to the table. So if you can come on the 1st, it'd be great. So great. Thanks, Father Adrian. And have